So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. I see a lot of friendly faces as well as some new ones or maybe some ones that haven't joined in a while. So thanks to all of you for joining us. My name is Cyrus Worrells and I'm Director of Programs at the Institute for Spirituality and Health in the Texas Medical Center. And for those who may be unfamiliar or haven't been to a program in a while, ISH is 65 years old as of this year. We were founded in 1955 as one of the early institutions of the medical center by some philanthropists and some physicians who thought that medicine had lost its human heart, its connection with faith and humanity and spirituality, which in many ways ties to some of the messages of the book that Dr. Kripal will present today. And through our rich history, we've done a whole variety of programs and gone through many phases from the first nationally accredited chaplaincy training program to a period of bioethics research and study, to now the university model that we kind of operate under of research, education, and services. And we have a whole variety of programs all geared towards our mission of enhancing well-being by exploring the relationship between spirituality and health. And often the first question that we get asked when we present ourselves to someone new is, what do you mean by spirituality? And that's obviously a complex question, one that Dr. Kripal has spent some of his career exploring. But one definition that we like to use is from our president and CEO, Reverend Dr. John K. Graham, who's here with us, as our innate human ability to connect with one another, with our environment and the creatures of our environment, with the transcendent mystery that many of us call God, Allah, or Krishna, or maybe choose not to name and stand in awe of the mystery of the universe, and our ability to connect with ourselves. And another definition of spirituality, perhaps more loose or less eloquent, is just how we answer the big questions. That we're all spiritual in some way and that we all have answers to these big questions. And I think that brings us to the program that we have today and the book that Dr. Kripal has most recently published, called The Flip, Epiphanies of Mind and the Future of Knowledge. So to introduce Dr. Kripal, who is the J. Razor Chair of Religious Studies and Philosophy, or Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University, my alma mater. And he's published a lot of work over his career, most recently The Flip. And a lot of what he's examined is paranormal and mystical experiences, which paranormal and mystical are loaded terms, but he's done a lot to bring some of these experiences to light that the scientific and academic and medical communities have often tried to brush under the rug. And so without trying to give more of an introduction to the program, I'll just say that I personally have not been inspired this much by reading a book in recent memory towards re-examining my answers to the big questions and an excitement for where humanity can move. And I have a deep appreciation for the defense of meaning and humanity that Dr. Kripal expresses in this book. So I'm really happy that this day has finally arrived, Dr. Kripal, and to all of you for your patience. Those of you who registered way back in January might remember that we had a water main break that flooded most of the medical center. Somewhat ironically, sort of a cosmic joke. And then right as we were having this rescheduled for the in-person event, COVID struck. But we soldier on, and here we are. And personally, and considering the Institute and our history, it's a particular delight to have you, Dr. Kripal, because our Vice President, Stuart Nelson, who's also here, was one of your students. And I think it's fair, I don't want to speak for him, but it's fair to say that some of the inspiration that he felt in your class is what led him to study of religious studies and ultimately working at the Institute, which ultimately led to my being at the Institute. And so here we are. And I think with that, I didn't, like I said, want to give too much framing for the book, because I think ultimately it's a book about getting outside of our frames. But what I would like to do is something we sometimes do before programs, which is just a coming into presence and a practice of just arriving where we are, even though it's a virtual space. So I invite everyone now to take a moment to just sit and arrive right where you are. And allow the eyes to close. And notice all the swirling of your experience, from the sensations in your body to the sounds in the room. And all of the thoughts and feelings and beliefs that course through your mind. Allow yourself to arrive here as the person that you are. And set an intention now to listen with open ears, open eyes, open heart, and a beginner's mind. Take 3 deep breaths. Opening yourself to receive and listen. Allowing the eyes to open, coming back into this virtual space together. So again, Dr. Kripal, thank you so very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Or the screen, right? Yeah. So thank you, Cyrus, for that lovely introduction. I loved it because it was personal and it wasn't formal and didn't involve a lot of titles and books. It didn't sound like a resume. It sounded like a human being. So thank you for that. And I'm just very happy to be here. I'm very happy Stuart's here, Cyrus, John, the whole gang. I'm just honored to be here. And it's good to see you all in this weird moment, that we're in. I promised Cyrus I would talk for 4 hours. No, I didn't. I said I would talk for 35 minutes and then we would have a conversation, hopefully. And I thought, since, particularly now, I think this even more so now, since I see so many familiar faces who have heard me blab for so long and on so many other occasions, I want to focus on why I wrote this book, why this book, and maybe what it's about, trying to kind of lay some of the ideas out on the table that you haven't heard, or hopefully haven't heard. And then hopefully we can have some kind of conversation. So this book really, I mean, this question of what spirituality is, of course, is a question we get a lot, and we stumble around and we do our best with. But there's a lot of questions like that. And one of them that we get in the university a lot is, what are the humanities? And why should my daughter or my son major in the humanities and not, in some other much more practical field? And so we struggle a lot with this question: what are the humanities, and in particular, what are their relationship to the STEM fields, to the sciences, and to the medicine, and to engineering, and mathematics? And so this is really kind of the origin of this book. In 2014, I published a little manifesto in a newspaper called the Chronicle of Higher Education, just kind of the sort of the standard industry-wide newspaper in the academy. And this essay was called Visions of the Impossible. It's essentially chapter 1 in this book. And shortly after that piece came out, my literary agent actually got a phone call from an editor at a press called Bellevue Literary Press, which is, I think, very significant here, actually, because Bellevue Literary Press was founded by a medical doctor at Bellevue Hospital in New York. And this medical doctor, I think he's a cardiologist, John. I mean, I'm not really sure, actually, but I think that is his field. And he was very, very concerned about this, how the humanities and the sciences were sort of floating apart, and they were speaking less and less to one another, and that this was a problem. And so he founded this boutique press in the hospital to sort of bring them into conversation. And the editor there is a woman named Erica Goldman. And Erica and I got on the phone in it was 2014 is when it was. And Erica introduced herself as a New York editor, very skeptical of the kinds of things I was writing about, but very puzzled because she couldn't disagree with anything I had said in this manifesto. She said, I was really puzzled by my reaction to your essay. And she said, would you consider expanding this essay into a book? And I immediately said yes, and then I didn't do anything. I just waited for years because I was doing other things. And she was very gentle and gracious, and she kept coming back. And eventually we finished this book together in about 2017, and it came out in 2018. And behind this book really are my students at Rice. And I think those of you who have been in those classrooms can appreciate how they are dominated by STEM students. And by STEM students, I simply mean young women and men who are going to go into the world and become medical doctors or engineers, or work in oil and gas, become chemists, what have you. And they're predominantly oriented towards some kind of materialist framework. And they believe that science has proven or established this materialist framework. And so when I began teaching at Rice, and I began teaching this big survey course called RELI 101, I was using pretty standard text to talk about religious experience, essentially. And of course, the religious experiences were those of religious people. And I recognized very quickly that these young people could just dismiss them immediately. They would just put them to the side. These are just crazy religious people. They don't know their science. And if they knew their science, they wouldn't say these silly things. And so I decided, you know what? I'm going to use the religious experiences of scientists and engineers and medical doctors, and then let's see what they say. And so that's what I started to do. I started to bring in experiences of those sorts of people, and I found that it really did help. It didn't actually solve anything. It didn't fix the problem of these worldviews these young people had, but it at least got them thinking in a way that I don't think they otherwise would have thought. And so the flip really is really just an extension of those two moments. those two pedagogical moments, one writing the essay and the chronicle, and watching watching the feedback. I'm using the word feedback very diplomatically. It was a yeah, it was interesting. It was a rout in some ways. It was a party in others. It was really passionate in many ways, but it was generally positive, and I found that really, really interesting. And the classroom experiences over and over again were, I think, useful as well. So the flip, what's the flips about? So I'm not going to presume any of you have read it. I know some of you have. I apologize if this is repetitive, but Cyrus asked me to summarize the chapters, so I'm a good boy. So I'm going to do what he says, and I'm going to summarize the 5 chapters. So chapter 1 is called Visions of the Impossible. It's essentially this chronicle piece I told you about. It begins with a story many of you have heard of Mark Twain, who dreamed his brother's funeral in great detail 2 weeks before he was dead, actually, or killed by an opium overdose, actually, after he was horribly burned in a boiler accident. But this really struck Twain, and Twain thought that this experience somehow laid, or that these precognitive dreams, as it were, somehow laid at the center of his literary creativity. And I also tell a story of actually a hospital chaplain who was totally freaked out when a woman came to, I think it was a her, and essentially told her how they found the body of her husband who had died in a car accident. And the way they found the body was he came to her in an apparition and told her, A, that he was dead, and he was sorry about that. Apparently, husbands have to apologize to wives even after they die, believe it or not. It's true. So he apologizes to his wife that he's dead, and then he says, "My body's in this ravine. You should probably call 911." You know, not that that's going to do any good, but so she calls the police, and she tells them where the body is, and that's where the body was. So these are the 2 stories I begin with, and then I just kind of tell story after story, and I sort of set out this model of the humanities and the sciences, where the humanities are really trying to get into this first person subjective state of purpose and meaning and a human life, whereas the sciences are kind of after this third person kind of exterior view of objects in space, and trying to quantify them and measure them and predict their behavior, and how these are really 2 very different kinds of enterprises, but at the end of the day, they're both human. I have never run across a piece of science that wasn't written or conceived by a human being. If you have, let me know. I'd like to see it. So I often say that the sciences are actually just divisions of the humanities. They don't know that, but that's actually the case. And so that's what this essay does. It tries plays out this idea that the humanities are just sort of fundamental to how we know the world, whether that's through science or medicine, or whether that's through reading literature or philosophy or religion or something. Then in chapter 2 is called Flipped Scientists. And I tell the story of about a dozen, some very, very prominent scientists and engineers who began their careers convinced materialists. In other words, believing only matter exists and matter is ultimately dead, even though it appears to be alive. It's really just a bunch of dead little stuff bouncing around in empty space according to predictable statistical mathematical laws. And that consciousness, or what we used to call the soul, is essentially an illusion and is just a product of brain matter, which is ultimately dead as well. So this was their worldview. And then they had some kind of experience. In one case, Hans Berger, who was an inventor who helped create something that eventually became the EEG machine. Hans Berger was in actually a military accident that his sister knew instantly, 60 miles away. And this just shocked him, actually. And when he was trying to invent what would become the EEG, what he was really trying to invent was a piece of technology that could pick up what we would call telepathy today. He failed to do that, but he invented the EEG in the process. So it was sort of a second best thing. I go through A.J. Ayer, who's a really famous British philosopher and atheist who choked on a piece of salmon and had a near-death experience, actually. Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon who wrote a book about his own near-death experience. Barbara Ehrenreich, a cell biologist and well-known social feminist, social critic, who essentially experienced the whole world as alive as a teenager. Marjorie Hines Wollicott, a neuroscientist who took a retreat with a Hindu guru who touched her forehead with his finger and sent this, essentially this little living lightning bolt down into her heart region, which then opened up into this sort of blissful experience of cosmic love. Wolfgang Pauli, the quantum physicist, Bernardo Kastrup, computer scientist, working today actually, a Dutch computer scientist who has written a number of books on his own idealism, or the notion that really there's only mind, and what we think of as matter is an expression or an emanation of mind. And Carrie Mullis, who's many of you have heard me talk about. Carrie was a biochemist who invented something called the PCR process and had a major abduction experience in his cabin in the early to mid 1980s. And so each of these scientists flips essentially in some way. They don't all flip in the same way. Some of them actually don't flip entirely, but they sort of flop maybe. And one of the things I look at, which I think is really interesting, and I hope we can talk about, to me, this is one of the most interesting aspects of the whole phenomenon, is how these people don't want to talk about it. I think we operate in our culture and in our world with it. These are somehow rare or unusual or odd experiences. I actually don't think they're rare at all. I think we're swimming in them all the time. But our culture keeps them suppressed. We willingly don't talk about them. And one of the people I'm thinking of is sitting in this room with us is Elizabeth Crone, who's on this crazy Brady Bunch screen that I have here, this Brady Bunch family that's kind of gone wild. She's over on this other column. It took Elizabeth almost 30 years to really come out and talk about her near-death experience. And she's not a trained scientist or engineer. She was just responding to social pressure. I talk about this other story in the book where this male medical doctor, had a near-death experience which essentially flipped him. And he went to a friend of mine named Bruce Grayson, who's a psychiatrist who studies near-death experiences, and he asked Bruce for help. And so Bruce offered to be essentially the therapist between this male doctor and his wife, who was also a doctor. And so the three of them sit down, and the husband begins to embarrassingly, shamefacedly tell his materialist wife about his near-death experience. And she interrupts him, as wives sometimes do, and says, "Wait a minute, I had one of those experiences just like that, and I didn't tell you because I was afraid you would make fun of me." And of course, that's why he didn't tell her. And so you had this situation where a husband and a wife had both had an experience that had essentially rocked their worldviews, but they would not speak about it to their spouse because it was too culturally dissonant. It meant too much, essentially. And I think you see this over and over again. Twain was, by the way, the same way. Twain didn't want to write about it either because of his own professional concerns. And so this is kind of what I look at in this chapter called Flip Scientists. Chapter 3 is called Consciousness and Cosmos. I don't think we want to get into this one because it's a pretty technical discussion of the philosophy of mind and its relationship to matter. And I essentially say, Houston, we have a problem. We really, not only do we not know what the relationship between mind and matter is, we actually don't know what mind is. And believe it or not, we don't know what matter is. And this was the real shock for me, after spending over 10 years with physicists for a long period of time. And I mean 5 days at a time, hanging out with physicists. I really was shocked to learn that professional physicists actually have no idea what matter is. What they will say is, we can tell you how it behaves, and we can tell you how it's structured. We can statistically predict its behavior in great and significant detail, but we simply have no way of asking, or much less answering, the question of what it is. And so what this chapter explores is what really, really smart people who have thought about these things, what they think matter is and what they think mind is, and how they think they might actually be two sides of the same coin, as it were. Chapter 4 is called Symbols in Between. This is really aimed at my humanist students and colleagues. And by humanists, I just simply mean people who study the humanities. I don't mean philosophical humanists. And I just kind of show how the academy has essentially boxed us into a corner. And one of the ways it's done that is by denying the symbol. 50, 60 years ago, if you would have been trained in the humanities, you would have learned about the symbolic, and you would have learned that sometimes symbols manifest and actually participate in that which they're signaling or symbolizing. I don't think most people believe that anymore in the academy. They think all signs or representations are arbitrary and don't refer to anything other than other signs and representations. And so you just kind of talk about this representation linked to this one, linked to that one, linked to this one. You can get into this sticky web, but you can actually never get out of it. These things don't refer to anything at all. And I just compare that to this older, and I think more accurate view, where human beings sometimes do have an experience of something outside themselves, and their minds and their spirits express this in symbolic fashion. They have a vision, or they have a dream, or they have a near-death experience. And so I talk about that problem, which I think is the basic problem of the whole thing. And then finally, in chapter 5, I talk about what I call the politics of the flip. And this is where it gets really sticky. Unfortunately, I do not think that flips automatically lead to social behavior or moral or political visions that we would like today. The truth is, a lot of traditional, hierarchical, very authoritarian, very violent cultures are sometimes based on flips or privileged flipped states of mind, and result in things that I don't think any of us would probably vote for. Maybe some of us would, but I think most of us wouldn't. And so I discussed this difficult question of what would a world look like if more people had flipped, and how is it that we can flip people in a way that is more reliable and safer, essentially. And my answer, which probably won't surprise you and which sounds self-serving, but I happen to believe it, is that the best way to flip people is through education, and through the humanities, and through the gradual introduction of these ideas and these figures through reading and talking and meeting like this. So I think people do flip. I think students flip. Stuart, I think you flipped. Cyrus, you probably flipped. Students flip in the classroom all the time, but not always, maybe not even often. And to me, that's the real mystery here. This is the real question. Why do some people flip and other people don't? And I think we have to we have to honor and understand the people who don't flip or won't flip as much as we honor and try to understand the people who do flip. Because I think people don't flip for good reasons. I mean, I think I understand why they don't flip. But I think a lot of our social problems, a lot of our moral questions, certainly a lot of our ecological or environmental crises, I think are the result of an inadequate worldview and an inadequate view of who we are and what we are. And so I think these sorts of questions are not just questions you ask in a book or in a classroom, but these are the kinds of questions that can really change the world if they kind of get out there into the world. But they're not easy ones. And I guess that's kind of how I want to end here. I've been thinking a lot about higher education. I work in a dean's office now, luckily not as the dean, luckily as her sidekick. And so I watch her and I watch the administration, and I think about higher education a lot. And I think a lot about how elite and privileged it is, and how that's probably necessary. And I also think about my family back in Nebraska, mostly farmers, who I don't think would understand 90% of what goes, 95% of what is said in a classroom at my university. That's not a snarky judgment. It's just an observation. And I worry about that. I worry about that abyss between higher education and the American public, and I'm not exactly sure what to do about it. That's kind of what I really do worry about. And it might be necessary. I mean, that's kind of, I suppose, the thought I want to leave you with. If you look at the history of the humanities, they've never been popular. They've never been democratic. They've never been available to everyone. They were actually born in the European monastic universities among super elite, super educated monks and intellectuals. 95% of the population couldn't even read. So I wonder about that, and I think about that a lot, and the kind of responsibility that puts on someone in higher education, or someone I suppose who's already educated. So, Cyrus, maybe I'll stop there. We can see where people are at, and of course I can blab more, but I'd rather not blab. I'd rather listen.
Well, thank you, and I think we'll open it up to questions for everyone. And since we have 40 people on the call, I think the best way, as we've done before, is just to put your questions in the chat, and I'll read them out in the order that that they come in. And we already have a question from my boss, John, who I'm going to intercede in front of with a question that I really want to ask first, while there's not a series of questions in the chat yet, which is, you've used the term the flip, obviously throughout the book and throughout speaking now. And I think I can sort of easily see from what you've just said that people who flip are flipping from a place of perhaps trusting a materialist view, and the sense that we get it with the materialist framework. But could you say a little bit more about what people, where do they land after they've flipped?
Right. So that's the conversation I didn't have, when I was talking about chapter 3. Chapter 3 basically talks about 5 places they land. There's not one place to land. There are many. But generally speaking, the flip is when a person is convinced there's only matter, and they flip into a conviction that actually mind or consciousness or the soul or the spirit or whatever your language is actually as fundamental as matter is, and maybe more fundamental. So they move from this worldview in which there is only matter and mind is some kind of product of matter, they move to a worldview in which mind or consciousness is fundamental and matter is likely an expression of that mind. And that's what I mean by the flip. And I think that the really important thing to understand there with the scientists and the engineers is what they realize after their flips is that their science or medicine works just fine in the new worldview, that their materialism was just an interpretation of their science. It wasn't the science. Science is a method. It's not a philosophical worldview. And so, but it tends to be conflated with the worldview of materialism. We tend to equate science and materialism. And what these flip scientists realize is that that's just an arbitrary conflation that is temporary and it's just part of our cultural moment, but it actually isn't true. And it's not that matter ceases to be important or materialism ceases to work. They still work. They're just half right now. They're not the whole truth. The body really is a kind of biological machine, but that doesn't mean that's all we are. And that's what the flip convinces people of, is that we're more than just the biological machine.
Thanks. I think you referenced a cultural moment that we don't see, that the cultural moment we're in has to do with that conflation of science and materialist worldview, which I think feeds pretty nicely into the question that John asks, which is, are some cultures more open to the experience? In other words, those less scientific. And does it require spiritual experience to make the flip? Will just learning about them open the door to flipping?
Yeah.
John, I'll say he added that he thinks your book is very important, which is why he purchased 100 copies. In fact, I personally witnessed.
Well, thank you, John. That's great. I appreciate that. So yeah, I think some cultures set us up for flips more easily than others, but they will inevitably interpret those in whatever their local religious language is, which is fine. But then the problem with that is sometimes then those religious languages will become exclusive, and they'll say the flip is just about this, as opposed to this universal human potential, which I think it is. What was the second question, John?
Will just learning about them open the door to flip?
Probably not. I mean, actually, sometimes it does work that way. There are human beings on the planet who are flipped by just reading books, believe it or not. But for most of us, we're duller than that, and something extraordinary. Unfortunately, it's often traumatic has to happen. Like a near-death experience or getting struck by lightning or something in Elizabeth's case.
So Stephen Finley asked about the books. This is a practical question. And just to anybody who ordered a book, we have them. We want Dr. Kripal to sign them, and then we'll make them available for pickup. And we'll try to do that as soon as we can. But obviously coronavirus has complicated things a little bit, but we'll get back to you with all of that. And Dr. Sonia Sloan, who's a board member at ISH, asked to just ask a question directly because it's too long to write. So since I think you can go ahead.
I love the book. I have been enthralled with this book. This is a book that has to be read multiple times to really digest it and appreciate it. And I think as a person, I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and so not knowing what we go through and the trauma, and now this book has actually challenged me even more in looking at medicine and my spirituality. My husband's a minister of a very large congregation. So my question is more on the fact of if you haven't been traumatized and you are super spiritual, and we're talking on the spiritual realm that you talk about in the book with the symbols and the ideology that won't allow people to sometimes see that level, how do you bring a flip concept to a group of people that probably really do need to be challenged? How do you introduce that discussion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll say that there's sort of two audiences that I'm trying to speak to really always. One is the religious audience that I think you're referring to, and the other is the scientific audience that we've been talking about. And both of them have ways, they have immunological responses to these flips that are pretty well worn. Religious communities will often invoke, unfortunately, demonic language, and it's their way of preserving their own particular worldview. And the scientific or materialist community will invoke all sorts of rhetoric, haul out of the closet, like anecdote and, and extreme claims require extreme evidence, and memes like that. But they're both resisting, I think, what these flips are ultimately about, which is a kind of shared humanity that doesn't actually depend on any particular religious system, much less any scientific practice. And I just don't think we're there yet, Sonia. I don't think as a culture we're ready for that. And we have really lame phrases like being spiritual but not religious, but they're kind of vacuous and they're kind of placeholders. They're ways the culture's trying to create a third space, but just hasn't yet. I hear you. I don't really have an good answer for you, which I think might be really for your husband, right?
Yeah. I want to buy the book for
Anya,
I certainly can't. You're echoing really badly.
Sonia, we can't hear you. It's a communication problem.
I don't know if he's ready for it. He's a super left brain, but he can. It's not there. Cosmos and oh, okay. Maybe. No. Okay.
it's better now. It's better now.
It's better. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think he's ready for the book yet. I think he is intrigued by the idea, but the faith side and my science side, they don't intertwine on that level, and I think because of my challenge in medicine and STEM, I'm curious, but also I've been traumatized. So therefore I've looked for why the flip is there, and I understand the flip. I've seen the flip. I understand what that means. Yeah. But bringing that to a church level of what we know as church, I would love to introduce the idea and be like John and buy 100 books for everyone because I love it that much and I think they need to read it. I don't know if they are ready for it. You're right. The conversation.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at in my final comments too, right? Yeah. I come from a church environment. I come from a German Catholic background in the Midwest, Nebraska, and small town, and I love those people. That's my family, but I don't. I think most people need faith, and they need a religion, and they need something that's more translated and more local. And I'm actually fine with that. It's the problem is that when you get all of these local convicted faith traditions, they start to beat heads. And your problem is you work in a hospital where you're gonna float through about 50 worldviews in a day, whether you know it or not. So you are completely convinced that I'm speaking for you, Sonia, but I'm just guessing that you're already convinced that the local language around these things is not actually what's dominant or necessary. What's necessary is this deeper spiritual or deeper humanity that can be expressed in any number of cultural or religious ways. That's a flip, by the way. That's definitely a flip. Just, there's a point in this last chapter of the book, which you probably remember, in which I'm talking about religion, religious faith. And I'm saying, the difference between a flipped person and someone who's not flipped is that the flipped person might appreciate religion, but knows that religion is always going to be local, and that it can always be, there's something deeper than it, that all religion's human, but not all humanity is religious in a specific way, right? That's the kind of challenge here. And that's what I often tell my students in the classroom who are religious is, look, I appreciate your background, but my problem is I have to appreciate everybody's background. I can't just pull yours out and say, here it is, this is it. Sorry, the rest of you, you're all wrong. I don't see any, first of all, I don't think there's any good intellectual reason to do that. And it's horrible pedagogy, by the way. But so my church is the classroom, and your church is the pediatric hospital, and your husband's church is a church. And those three social settings, I think, largely determine or shape what we're going to think.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So, Stuart says, probably a flip can inspire more creative science and actually enhance those tools rather than detract from them. And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's certainly what the flip scientists say, Stuart. I mean, they would even go further than that. They would say, not only do these experiences inspire scientific creativity and can create new technologies, by the way, as we saw in the case of Hans Berger, but they might also actually create a whole new way of knowing that isn't even yet imagined. That can somehow combine this first person and this third person perspective. They might be inspiring ways of knowledge and technologies that we don't even have yet, and we can't have in our present frameworks. So these scientists are kind of after the frameworks. They don't want to just do more science and more technology, although they do that too. They want to blow up the whole framework and sort of get to this new worldview in which other things are possible.
Paula Hartman-Stein asked, what risks do you think psychologists take who write or lecture about flip ideas? She's a psychologist for 35 years and a journalist, but have trepidation about revealing her flip experience except to individual patients who already know and respect her.
Yeah. Jim Lomax is here, and Jim and I wrote an essay together about this very problem among psychiatrists. Generally speaking, flipped psychiatrists and scientists don't talk about their experiences until they retire, and then they do. Then they write books, and then they feel safe. I actually think that's a problem. I think that's what preserves the disciplinary censoring that's going on. I wish more people would step out of the closet and join me in ruining my reputation. People often ask, the question I usually get, it really, to translate the question, it's, how do you get away with this? And my answer is, oh, I don't know anything. That's how I get away with it. I'm just a dumb professor of religion. If I were a physicist or a heart surgeon, I wouldn't be saying anything, And that's exactly what you see if you look at this literature, is that there are physicists and there are surgeons writing in this, but they're retired, and they're not saying it, in the heart of their career. And so again, I think we're back to this politics of knowledge that I was trying to get at earlier.
So Bridget admits she hasn't read the book, but I think she's still asked a good question. Does there have to be a flip, or can someone embrace both sides?
No, I don't think there doesn't have to be a flipped experience. I think some people do embrace both sides. But the question for me again is why? Why do those people embrace it and other people can't? I mean, I think that's really the question. For an educator anyway, that's the question I would want to ask. But yeah, no, you have people who are already essentially on board with the idea who have never had such an experience.
So Nancy Lomax, I don't know if Nancy and Jim are both here, but the Lomaxes ask, what about the recent proliferation of conspiracy theories such as gynecological disorders are caused by dreaming of sexual encounters with demons? There are quite a few of these recently. How do you understand and respond to them?
I've never heard of, I mean, this is news to me. It doesn't surprise me though. I mean, unfortunately, this world is this zone that we're talking about is filled with conspiracies. Why? I mean, it's a really good question. There is a wonderful book called Cultures of Conspiracy by a sociologist named Michael Barkun. And Jim or Nancy, if this question is coming from you, if you have some time, I would encourage you to read that book. Basically, what Michael says is conspiracies are attractive and proliferate because people feel that the world is out of control and they don't understand it. And yet the conspiracy gives them this secret key that they now somehow have the knowledge, and it gives them power again. And even if it's not true, even if the conspiracy is total nonsense, they at least think they know the truth of things, and it empowers them as individuals to kind of negotiate through this confusing world. I don't know. There might be something else behind that question I'm missing. I suspect it has something to do with Sonia's question earlier about how religious people respond to this, but I don't know. I don't know enough about the background of the question to say. You know, I'll just say, to bring this home, I'll just tell you a suspicion I have. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's just a suspicion. But I read in the news a few months ago that a lot of people who had COVID and were in hospitalized for it and on ventilators for sometimes weeks at a time were coming out, and I forget the language of the journalist, but it was something like they were hallucinating or they were essentially psychotic. I forget the language that was used, but my suspicion is that they were having all kinds of altered states, you know, during this essentially this near-death experience, and that we don't, as a culture, have any way of talking about those things other than as hallucinations or psychosis, and that maybe they're mixed up with psychotic episodes. You know, I think that's also very possible as well. This is a real rabbit hole. I'm of the strong opinion that sometimes these mystical experiences occur within psychotic episodes or within otherwise really dangerous and really destructive forms of human suffering. And I'm not romanticizing one. I'm just observing that sometimes they go together.
So Chris asked, how does the rest of creation fit into this? Like, can a corn stalk flip, or can a dog?
I have no idea. I mean, I haven't talked to a corn stalk lately, although I have to say some of these flips involve living corn stalks. I mean, not corn stalks per se, but they involve experiences of the world as conscious, essentially. So I think a lot of these flip people would say the world is already flipped. We just don't know it, you know. And pets, I mean, pets are really, dogs in particular. I'm a dog person, I'm not a cat person, but pets are, you know, lots of people report really bizarre experiences with pets. so I would not restrict this to human beings, by the way. But we have enough on our hands trying to figure out ourselves. I don't pretend to be able to figure out our furry companions.
So Elizabeth Crone also said she also has a comment too long to type. So Elizabeth, if you want to chime in.
Yes, I wanted to say that along the lines of physicians flipping, I was invited to a luncheon last spring, which was then canceled because of COVID, and it just happened on Zoom on Tuesday. So I was there. It was the Retired Physicians Organization here in Houston, and their speaker was Dr. Yvonne Kaysen, who is the former president of IANS, which is the International Association of Near-Death Studies. And so she spoke, and the turnout that they had for this meeting of retired physicians was double the size of their normal meetings. And nobody left, and she spoke longer than she had planned to, and there were a lot of questions, and it went on and on and on. And it was fascinating to me because, well, first of all, kind of sad because these are all retired physicians. So they no longer have patients coming to them saying, this happened to me, and they can't offer any comfort in that respect. But after the meeting, I knew there were probably 125 physicians there, maybe. And I think I knew about 10 of them, maybe. And I started getting emails after I didn't make any comments at all during the talk and the questions, but because 8 or 10 of these people knew me and knew about my experience, I started getting emails from them. And they were saying, you know, for years I had patients coming to me saying that this happened, and I never believed them. So I just find it sad that, yes, they are flipping, but it's kind of late. It's kind of after it really does any good. I mean, it's still great. I'm glad they flipped. I'm glad they're understanding that this is actually a thing that happens, but I'm just commenting. It's not a question, Jeff. It's just a comment that I think it's that they didn't listen earlier.
Yeah, but it raises the question, which I think is, I'm sure John's question and the Institute's question of how would healthcare change if the view of the human was different and you know, essentially more profound and more spiritual along these lines. And of course it would change dramatically. It might not change what medications one prescribes or what surgeries one does, but it would definitely change how one relates to patients. And the patients would likely feel much more comfortable sharing these sorts of experiences.
So Chris Collins asked, how are flip experiences different from mystical experiences?
Well, I'm not sure. Those are just 2 words, Chris. I'm not sure they are different, frankly. I mean, generally what we mean by mystical experiences are experiences that are interpreted in religious ways that involve some kind of union or communion with a deity or with the natural world, where what I'm calling the flip is essentially a similar kind of event, but is usually understood in more secular or scientific terms. You know, they'll talk about consciousness, or they'll talk about mind. They're not going to talk about spirit or soul, but I'm not sure they are different. I think we're just talking about them differently.
So I'm aware we've come to our hour mark, and Dr. Kripal has generously agreed to answer some further questions for a little longer, but I do want to give this opportunity and thank anyone who would like to step off at this time. And just know we are recording, so any of the other questions that you miss, if you have somewhere else to be, we'll send out the video. soon. And in case anyone's leaving, I do want to say that I think, you know, John obviously shares in my excitement for this book, and Stuart and the Institute. It's so relevant to who we are and what we do. And it's constantly a question of how not to like convince the medical community, but to just begin a conversation that feels a little safer for them, where they can engage these kinds of questions that have a promise for. And so that's all to say that I know this isn't obviously going to be our last engagement with you, Dr. Kripal. And I'm thinking sort of definitively now that we'll probably host some kind of book club or discussion group around the book, as well as maybe some follow-up programs. So to anybody who's maybe about to leave, if that even is anybody, you know, just please stay tuned that at least we have this community, and there are others, you know, communities like this that want to engage these questions. And I think it becomes more powerful when we stay together and continue interacting and asking. So anybody who's jumping off, please, you know, stay tuned, and thanks again for joining. So Stephen Finley asked, what do you consider some of the top historical flip moments, i.e. Newton or Copernicus? So maybe some larger, grand, or particularly influential flips.
Well, Stephen, are you asking me about Copernicus and Newton, or are you just using them as metaphors?
Metaphors.
Okay. It's a good question. I think a lot of the people we read in the humanities, sort of the giants of the humanities, were essentially flipped. And that they, you know, people like Hegel and Nietzsche, for example, I think they were definitely flipped individuals. And we've sort of suppressed that fact in the humanities, and we read them otherwise today. But I think the sciences in particular have progressed by essentially putting to the side this kind of conversation, you know. What I learned from all my scientific colleagues is the science works because it gets to say what's real and what to study, and things that it can't study, it just says are not real. And that's, of course, kind of a shell game, but it works for some reason. And so I think it's harder to see in the history of science, you know, Stephen, if that's what you're asking me, than it is, say, in the history of humanities, or much less the history of religion, where it's everywhere. I mean, pretty much any conversion experience or any major religious event is a flipped event. It's harder to see in the history of science, but you can see it if you know what you're looking for. I know that's not much of an answer, but that's what I would say.
That's okay, you know.
So I have a question, and it kind of is following from something you referenced in answer to the Lomax's question about conspiracy theories, that people kind of prefer to have an explanation, you know, that it's kind of like there's something safe in that. And I wonder, just generally, why is the scientific and medical and even academic, and honestly just the community at large, so resistant to these experiences and shun them? Why does it have that psychological hold?
So I think there are a lot of answers, Cyrus. I think that's actually a profound question. This gets back to something Sonia was asking earlier. A lot of flipped individuals in the history of religions were actually killed. Jesus among them, by the way. You know, human beings who experience divinity or their own deification tend not to do well in their cultural surrounds. And human culture is pretty brutal. when it comes to dealing with these kinds of flipped experiences. There's also the whole history of another way that individuals are flipped and empowered is through what most people would think of as magical practice. And the history of monotheism and religion in general has not been kind to people who have practiced various magical rituals either, because magic empowers the human being. It isn't a power that derives from some external God. It derives from the human being. So I'm saying there are deep religious reasons for these resistances. I think the more immediate scientific or secular reasons is that people really fear a return to some kind of medieval darkness that they're imagining. You know, whether there ever was such a thing is another question, but I think they're really fearing, they're also fearing fundamentalism, frankly. They see a lot of social intolerance and a lot of hatred among the religions today. And so they think anything that will take us back to a religious worldview is going to be bad. And so I think that's where partly the resistance comes from, Cyrus. I think it also comes from the false belief that affirming these states somehow disproves science. I think that's nonsense. I think it relativizes science, you know, and makes it true on a relative level, but it certainly doesn't erase the accomplishments of science or technology. So I think there's a lot of cultural baggage that we're carrying around with us through all these histories. And I think when secular people resist this so forcefully, it's coming out of these deeper cultural histories.
I wonder if that's kind of maybe a sensitive point that could ease some of the barriers towards even hearing the conversation, is kind of trying to educate scientists and doctors that the argument being made here is not that science is not something contradictory to scientific discovery.
Right, but this is where it gets difficult. And this is where I've learned a lot from my scientific colleagues and historians of science. You know, I just finished this wonderful book by this evolutionary biologist named Scott Turner, which I recommend to everyone. It's called Purpose and Design. And Scott is not a religious person. He has no religious axe to grind, but he's totally convinced that Darwinian models of evolution don't work. That there is evolution, but that it's clearly driven by some kind of purpose and design and intelligence, essentially. And he looks at religious communities that, of course, give a religious answer to where the purpose and design come from. They invoke some kind of God. He doesn't do that. But basically what Scott says is, look, you might think that we won the Scopes trial, but we didn't. And the longer scientists keep pushing this meaningless, nihilistic, depressing materialism and mechanism, the quicker they're going to lose this cultural conversation. And so he really goes after his fellow scientists and really wants them to distinguish between their science and their interpretation of their science. And he wants to force them into seeing that it actually matters what they say, because they're the new cultural authorities, right? And their interpretation of evolution, that it's meaningless and random, there is no design, there is no intelligence, is itself A, an interpretation, B, a bad interpretation, because there is design and there is intelligence, and C, has devastating cultural effects that they're responsible for. So, I mean, this is kind of what I'm trying to say in the book as well, is that, you know, scientists and intellectuals are not innocent here. They're pushing some pretty nasty medicine. But that's not science. You know, that's not science per se. That's an interpretation of science. And that's the distinction we have to draw really carefully here. I don't know if I'm making sense, Cyrus, but I think it's a really serious question. And you know, there's a point in the book which is entitled "How Not to Make Fundamentalism Stronger." And basically, what I say is, look, if you want to stop making fundamentalism stronger, stop all of this nihilism and all this mechanism and materialism, because fundamentalism is just a reaction formation against this meaningless world you're pushing. If you really want to resolve the situation, create a science that is meaningful and deeply human and spiritual and can integrate all of these experiences. Stop pushing this really depressing thing that people are going to react against, because fundamentalism is fundamentally a reaction. It's fairly modern, by the way. It's not this ancient thing that people imagine.
Mm. Well, it's a conversation we want to keep exploring, certainly. John noted that Lois Stark is here, and she was our last book spotlight speaker on her book, The Telling Image, The Shape of Changing Times, and another big picture look at meaning and sort of stepping outside of even how we see the world, and looking at it through shapes. And so John is putting to her, and Lois, we're kind of putting you on the spot here. And if you don't have a comment, there's no pressure, but just an invitation to you, Lois, if there are particular shapes or structures that might open the door to flipping, or maybe just how shape would relate to this process. Do you want to share anything?
It strikes me that both sides are forms of inquiry, science and the humanities. And if the accent can be on the question rather than the answer in that process of what is creation, what is the human, that then they become partners toward the exploration, which is life itself. And if there is a shape, it probably is one that is dynamic and in process and movement, because it wouldn't be held, if it was held in a static, fixed way, it would be a past answer or a partial answer. But since our explorations are always expanding, to try to give you some guess toward the shape, which was the question you asked, I would suggest imagining perhaps a spinning donut where you get the feedback loop, which is a part of nature, but it also is unpredictable and evolving if you imagine it as a recombination of what exists and what gets formed from what exists.
Wow, thank you. We need to put you on the spot more often.
It's kind of ask. And thank you to Dr. Kripal. I've heard so many wonderful things from your reputation, but just to the delight of having it firsthand.
Elizabeth Kennelly asked, could energy we experience in our personal searching, when we know we are searching but don't know for what, could that energy actually be flipping as an energy urging us towards the flip?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's the desire to have a flip. I mean, that desire to be someone else or to inhabit some other space. I mean, I think that's kind of what we're talking about here. I'm not really sure how literal she wants to be about energy, but I mean, there are flipped individuals in the book who talk a lot about energy and perceiving other forms of energy, you know, that are essentially alive. So maybe that's part of the answer too.
Well, I see in that kind of a reference to what Lois said about it being in process, and that that even it's an important question, I think, again, towards the sort of what do we do about it, and how do we continue inviting people to have this conversation. And there is that like liminal ground of people that kind of like maybe are still sort of attached to a materialism, but they're not satisfied with it, and maybe are like yearning for something more, but don't have enough of a peek into what that would be to kind of make that flip. Or maybe sort of more what Elizabeth is referencing, maybe kind of on the cusp of leaning into a flip, but you know.
I think a lot of it, frankly, requires artists and poets and writers. I mean, one of the ways I understand what it is I do is to just essentially walk into a room and talk about something in a way that intellectuals feel comfortable with. You know, my experience over and over again, lecturing and talking to people about these things, is that people who are educated in these ways are often very sympathetic, but they don't want to talk about it because they're afraid they'll sound like the tabloids or they'll sound silly. And so I think it's at least some of our jobs to forge languages and ways of speaking about these things that doesn't sound like the tabloids and sounds plausible. I mean, I think this is what Erica Goldman was saying to me, you know, in 2014 when she called me. She was like, wow, this sounds totally plausible to me. and I am not sympathetic to this stuff in general. So I think that's kind of what the goal is here. You know, one of my colleagues is a guy named Philip Ball. Philip's a quantum physicist, but he writes a lot. He writes a lot of books about a lot of different things. And one of the things Philip has written about, he wrote a book called Beyond Weird, which is all about quantum physics. But essentially what he argues is that, look, you actually cannot fit quantum physics into our present cultural imagination. It violates common sense, it violates grammar, it violates pretty much everything we think about the world. But that doesn't mean we should just call it weird, because that's a cop-out. What we really need are artists, you know, visual artists, storytellers, filmmakers, novelists, to take up what they understand by quantum physics and turn it into some kind of cultural imagination that we can hear and we can use. And that's what's going to change the world, actually, is give us a way to talk about this. And so that's actually how I see my own little vocation, is to essentially try to find ways of talking about things that people won't talk about. But let's be, again, honest, we're really slow as a culture. I mean, go back to something Stephen Finley said. We haven't even caught up to Copernicus yet. I mean, we're talking about the sunrise and the sunset, you know, 500 years after we figured out there ain't no such thing, right? The sun isn't setting and the sun isn't rising. We're spinning, but we haven't even incorporated that into our language, you know? So, you know, so much less quantum physics or the flip. I mean, we don't even have Copernicus down yet. So I think that's kind of the challenge here, is how do we just totally reimagine everything?
So So Linda Vogel makes a statement that I think you could respond to. She's a nurse. She said, the hard thing is about the amount of information that must be taught in medicine, or in her case, nursing. Nursing traditionally places a focus on humanities and the art of nursing, but it is hard to teach and the focus on evidence-based practice has taken the focus off of art.
Yeah, I'm sure she's right about that. And I think that's a shame. I mean, when I go see a doctor or go into a hospital and deal with medical personnel, I don't want to be treated as an evidence-based case. You know, I want to be treated as a human being, you know? And so I think I want them to be evidence-based as well. Again, it's not an either or. I think it's a both and. But I hear you, Linda. I hear the challenge is how to educate medical professionals in a way that can be both. And we're just not there yet, obviously. I mean, maybe it's not possible. I don't know. I don't work in a medical school.
That's a challenge for the Institute too. We do some work in some medical schools, and but of course it's such a delicate balance when you're trying to invite someone to even consider their own spirituality. To, you know, you're always working towards keeping their ears open and not pressing that button that's going to, you know, trigger the materialist, like, avoidance of what you're, you know, and dismissal. Sahil asked, would you say today is the age of scientific dogmatism in some way?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the present religion is science, you know, around the world. I mean, just look and listen, and I think the reason is, I mean, again, it's not unreasonable, and it's not like we can't understand this. Science and technology can make cool stuff. You know, we have refrigerators now and cell phones, and we're on this screen together now because of STEM, not because of the humanities. So, I mean, it works. It just works. And so again, this isn't an anti-science or anti-technology message, but to recognize that the technology and the science are being performed by human beings. They're not being performed by non-human beings. I think is the key.
So I think we got two more in the docket, and then I think we'll
Yeah, people look tired and
eat dinner
or something. I don't know. Maybe I'm projecting.
But Leah Adams, who's newest member of the Institute, asks, might we say that the concept of flipping is to turn the compassionate light of truth upon the circumstances in an unassuming and curious way?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. If the question is, does the flip always lead to compassion? I think the answer is problematic. It's probably no. It doesn't always lead there, but it certainly can lead there, and often does. Then this is why I was trying to say earlier that we need to link these flips to education and to things like moral education and discussions of compassion, because I think people can flip and come away with worldviews that are not compassionate or not humane, believe it or not. I mean, believe it or not, there are fascists and right-wing ideologues who are way into mystical experience and psychedelics and all kinds of stuff. You know, they've been using altered states of consciousness for war, for example, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So I don't think there's anything innately necessarily moral about these flip states. That, by the way, is the most radical thing I can say, and nobody listens to me. They just, their eyes glaze over and they go on to the next subject because they don't want to hear that. But I think it's true. I think it can kind of go either way. Charles Manson, by the way, was a real mystic. You know, and he famously said once, if God is one, what is bad? You know, So,
That's a good question to ask. I wouldn't say you went about it in the best way, but
no, I listen. No, I'm not either. I'm just saying let's not conflate flips with moral or political visions we want to encourage.
maybe that's part of why people are afraid of
Yeah,
flip
maybe.
experience. So Pat Graham, I love this question. You are using flip in the singular. Would you say that the flip itself just leads to flipping, like a continuing experience, an opening to more experience?
So yeah, I love this cover. I'm sure you saw the cover, Pat. It's not clear to me whether that little guy lands on his head or not, or whether he just floats off into space, right? He just like orbits into space and he's gone forever. Yeah, I mean, I think it's plural. I think there are many ways to flip. I think some people flip halfway. I actually talk about a character in the book, Michael Shermer, who I think half flipped. Shermer's a really famous skeptic, and he had a really profound paranormal experience at his wedding, of all places. But he never really flipped. He refused to flip. So I think it just depends. Yeah. So I think there are many of them.
I think that's something I struggle with, because I think it's possible to flip and maybe like land and then sort of end up kind of feeling like, well, I have these new answers or this new perspective. And then you're just kind of comfortable in that perspective. And I see a lot of people kind of with that now I have my story. Now this has been revealed to me, and this is what it is. And so it kind of stagnates and maybe needs another spin of the top.
Yeah. Or flip back. If you flip this forward, you can flip backwards, right?
All right. Well, thank you very much, especially for extending the extra 30 minutes to answer all of our questions. And like I said, I really hope that, and trust that we'll continue to engage you and continue to engage these questions. And
hopefully we can meet again, like in the flesh.
yeah. At some point.
It's very material of you.
Yeah. No. Hey, I'm all for matter in the body. I just.
Well, I hope that day comes not too far from now, but in whatever setting. Certainly, thanks for inspiring us, and may we continue to flip people, to flip ourselves. Keep our minds open. Thank you again so much, Dr. Kripal.
Okay, thank you all. It's good to see you all again.
Thanks to all of you for joining. Thanks for being part of the conversation, and hope to see you soon. And to anybody interested in some of our other programs, other book spotlights, anything more we do with this, continue to check us out at spiritualityandhealth.org. With that, thank you and good night.